Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7. So we're continuing our rebranded Scoundrel Business series of podcasts looking at the business side of releasing Star Wars movies. We talked about Deadpool yesterday and how it performed at the box office. Now, there's a website called Box Office Pro that does long-range tracking and predictions of movies and how they think they will perform at the box office in their opening weekend. For the record, they were off by about 6 or 7 million on Deadpool 2. They said 133 million and it came in at 126 million. So, I mean, pretty darn close for government work. And as far as Solo's predictions go, they have actually been trending downward over the past few weeks as we get closer and closer to the movie, although they had gotten positive reviews from critics, generally speaking. Okay, we can talk about the critic scores in a moment officially. The social media buzz, according to Box Office Pro, has been trending sharply downward, and that's also in comparison to how social media buzz was trending for Rogue One and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Those are the comparatives that they're looking at for Solo: A Star Wars Story. Now they are saying that the 4-day Memorial Day weekend gross, they're estimating it to be between 140 million and 170 million dollars. And if that is the case, if it actually falls within that range, then it's going to be the biggest Memorial Day weekend movie opening ever, because that record is held by a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and that didn't make 140 million. It was like 139 point something. So, you know, it's like there's a quote that's probably one of my favorites. It's from, Mark Twain said it, but he claimed that the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli originally said it, that there are 3 kinds of lies. There are damn lies, and there are statistics. So who really knows how this is going to turn out? But one thing we know for sure is that based on the way Rogue One performed, we're not expecting Solo: A Star Wars Story to perform at the level of The Force Awakens or even at the level of The Last Jedi. And so, really, when you think about it, not only is Rogue One the better comparative, like you can't compare it to either of the saga movies, but by the same token, you could consider Solo: A Star Wars Story as being a sequel of sorts. Yes, I know it's not a sequel, but it is a Star Wars story sequel in that it is the second movie of these standalone Star Wars stories to be released, and therefore you could consider it as a sequel of sorts, and that it might act like one, which means that it would be rather rare for it to overperform, outperform, one of the two. It would be a rather rare occurrence for Solo to outperform its predecessor, namely Rogue One. And sure, maybe this is a way to dampen expectations, if you will, and do it in a way that makes logical sense, where we're going to say, oh, okay, so it didn't perform as well as Rogue One. Well, it's not so bad because of all these other reasons, right? We could kind of talk ourselves into thinking that everything's okay. But I don't think it's just talking ourselves into it. And in fact, the thing that occurs to me about Solo: A Star Wars Story is the fact that there are a couple of generations of potential Star Wars movie viewers that did not grow up on the original trilogy. They grew up on the prequel trilogy. They grew up on the sequel movies. And so their experience of Han Solo is, all these old movies that a generation previously grew up to. And so they don't have the same connection to the original trilogy that some folks do. And so I think by volume, in fact, more people out there as Star Wars fans are connected to either the prequels or the sequels than to the original trilogy. So when you put it in that perspective, Solo is actually a rather unique property. It's got novelty value that at first blush, you might not believe. I mean, you might be more familiar with the Harrison Ford version of Han Solo or the Harrison Ford version of younger Han Solo, but there's a darn lot of folks out there who only have experienced Han Solo, or whose majorly significant experience with Han Solo is him going, "That's not how the Force works," and being a grumpy old man. So for those people, it's an entirely novel experience to be able to see young Han Solo, and it's not going to be Harrison Ford, and there are a lot of people who are perfectly fine with it not being Harrison Ford. Meanwhile, speaking of statistics and polling, as we have been, there are certain polls that movie studios do to try to predict what kind of promotional spending that they have to do to get the word out about a movie. And one of those things has to do with something called unaided awareness, which means that somebody is already aware of a movie coming out without having to be prompted about it, to say, hey, have you heard about Solo? Right? No, it's more like, what have you heard about, coming out? And somebody saying, oh, Solo, I know that's coming out, right? So apparently the unaided awareness poll for Solo: A Star Wars Story is actually higher than it was for Rogue One, and it's higher than it was for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, since we were talking about those two movies earlier. And there's also a definite interest polling thing as well. And Deadline Hollywood didn't share what the score was for definite interest in comparison to Rogue One or to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. It just compared it to Spider-Man Homecoming and said that it did better than Homecoming, and it made a mention of the fact that Homecoming did 117 million in its box office opening weekend, and so this bodes well by extension for Solo: A Star Wars Story that it will outperform Spider-Man. At least that's the implication that they're making. And why do we care? Why do we care about how it performs at the box office? Well, I mean, if you need a better indication of what fans think about Solo: A Star Wars Story, well, you don't really have a better one than box office. Yeah, you can look at user scores. Yeah, you can look at social media buzz. But really, people vote with their wallets, right? And so that is how we are going to know how Solo performs. And some of this polling that they're doing in advance to try and get a bead on how they think it's going to perform, well, that's the nearest thing we have to the real thing right now. And so that's why I'm particularly interested in it. And I'm not as interested in the whole user score situation, which we will talk about in the next day or so as we prepare for the final days of Solo: A Star Wars Story on Safe Week here on the podcast, where you're not going to hear any spoilery related stuff for Solo. You're just going to hear great and hopefully very interesting stuff about Solo and about how Lucasfilm is getting this movie ready for its delivery to all of us. And that's going to do it for the show today. On the audio version at sw7x7.com/iTunes or wherever you like to listen to podcasts, there will be a Last Jedi trivia question there for you if you want to check that out. For here, though, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for watching, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.